Today we will be considering the question, can the ancient wisdom of Aristotle's virtue ethics actually help us understand the modern gig economy? Can we in some way bridge ancient philosophy in the world of Uber drivers, people writing freelance and other such stuff? After all, Aristotle was writing over 2,000 years ago. Could he have imagined a world where people build careers, lives, if you will, by finding these short-term gigs online? Probably not. But his ideas about how humans flourish, what he called Eudaimonia, have a lot to say about the importance of work. He believed that work wasn't just about making a living. It was a crucial part of living a virtuous life. Work allows us to develop skills to contribute to society and ultimately to become better versions of ourselves. Aristotle was a big believer in social stability. He thought people needed a sense of community and belonging and security to really thrive. This is where we see one of the biggest tensions between Aristotle's philosophy and the gig economy. That's because the gig economy, with its short-term thinking, unpredictable income, and the lack of traditional work structures, can be inherently destabilizing. It's not exactly the ideal breeding ground for the kind of long-term character development that Aristotle had in mind. I recently read an article where a sociologist said that the gig economy is similar to a giant social experiment where we're all lab rats. And it just made me think about how the shift towards instability might be impacting people on a psychological level, perhaps even on a spiritual level. I mean, when you think about it, if you're constantly worried about where your next paycheck is coming from or whether you'll have enough work next month to pay your bills, it's hard to focus on anything else. It can create this feeling of constant anxiety and precariousness, which isn't exactly conducive to pursuing higher virtues like justice or generosity. That's because if you're in survival mode, you're probably less likely to worry about the greater good, don't you think? Aristotle believed that every activity has a telos, a reason for existing beyond simply its practical use. And the telos of work for him, it went far beyond just earning a day's wage. It was about contributing to something larger than yourself, developing your skills and participating in the life of the community. But in the gig economy, it seems like the telos of work can get a bit blurry. When work becomes fragmented into a series of disconnected tasks, often through these algorithmically driven online platforms, it can be easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. For example, you might be doing a series of small jobs, but do they really add up to a meaningful whole? Do you feel a sense of connection to the end product or to the people you're working with or for? Can you really develop a sense of purpose by doing many tiny, trivial tasks for very low pay, like a few mouse clicks to create a fake user account? Those are the kinds of questions that Aristotle would have us deal with when it comes to work. And this isn't just about individual fulfillment. Aristotle would argue that when we as individuals lose sight of the telos of work, it has this ripple effect on society as a whole. We become less invested in our communities, less concerned with the common good, and less likely to see work as a source of meaning and virtue. So, when we look at it from this perspective, it's not just about the individual worker feeling lost and alienated. It's about a potential shift in our collective understanding of what work is and what it's for. This forces us to ask some fundamental questions about the nature of work, its role in our lives, and how we can ensure that it contributes to, rather than detracts from, our individual and collective flourishing. It also leads us to another concept that Aristotle often mentioned, justice. Justice was a central concept for Aristotle. He saw it as giving everyone their due, ensuring fairness and balance in all aspects of life. And when we apply that lens to the gig economy, it raises a whole host of questions, like are gig workers being paid fairly? Do they have access to benefits? What about the power dynamics between the platforms and individual workers? Is there a level playing field? All of these crucial questions that I think Aristotle would be particularly concerned with when considering the potential for exploitation in the gig economy. When you have a system where individuals are competing for short-term gigs, often with very little bargaining power, it's easy for those with more power, the platforms, to take advantage. Some have pointed out that it's almost like we're returning to a pre-labor movement type world where individual workers are left to fend for themselves against robber barons without the protection of robust labor laws. This also raises questions about what kind of social safety net is needed in a world where traditional employment structures are becoming increasingly fluid. If work is no longer a guarantee of stability and security, how do we ensure that everyone has the opportunity to live a decent life? It would seem that the gig economy is forcing us to rethink some of our fundamental assumptions about work and its place in society. I think that's where Aristotle's emphasis on virtuous justice can be so valuable. It's not just about setting rules and regulations, it's more about cultivating a sense of moral responsibility in individuals and companies and in society as a whole. So how do we do that? How do we bring those ancient ideas about virtue into the modern world of the gig economy? Perhaps we need to move beyond just focusing on the problems and start looking at potential solutions and opportunities. Despite all the challenges, there are also some really interesting ways in which the gig economy might actually be conducive to cultivating certain virtues. Let's start by looking at some of the qualities that are essential for success in the gig economy. You have to be self-reliant, adaptable, resilient. You need to be able to manage your own time, set your own goals, and constantly learn new skills. Essentially a crash course in personal responsibility. Those are all qualities that Aristotle saw as essential for developing a virtuous character. So even though the gig economy can be unstable and unpredictable, it could also be a training ground for certain virtues that Aristotle would approve of. Of course, we need to realize that it's not a perfect system, and there are plenty of challenges to overcome. But it's important to recognize that there are potential benefits alongside the risks. So it's more than just fixing the system, but also figuring out how individuals can thrive within the system as it exists. In some ways, it's about personal agency and taking responsibility for your own flourishing, even in the face of adversity, something that we can cultivate through practice. But what about the bigger picture? What roles should governments and policymakers play in all of this? Aristotle had a lot to say about the state's responsibility to foster a just and virtuous society for its citizens. For Aristotle, the purpose of government was to create the conditions that allowed citizens to flourish. So how do we apply that to the gig economy? Should platforms be held accountable for worker well-being? Should there be more regulation? These are complex questions, but I think Aristotle would encourage us to approach them with a focus on fairness, balance, and the common good. For Aristotle, it was all about finding the right balance, what he called the golden mean between extremes. So how do we find that balance in the gig economy? How do we create a system that is both dynamic and just? We don't want to stifle innovation, but we also don't want to go back to the days of sweatshops and exploitation. So let's consider some of the public policy ideas that have been floated for creating a more ethical gig economy. One suggestion that keeps popping up in one form or another is the idea of portable benefits. The basic idea is that benefits like health insurance, retirement savings, and similar benefits would all be tied to the worker, not the employer. So even if you're bouncing between different gigs, you'd still have that safety net in place. The idea is to provide a level of stability and security that's often lacking in the gig economy. This would align with Aristotle's emphasis on creating the conditions for human flourishing, since if people are constantly stressed out about health care, child care, or similar issues, it's hard for them to focus on developing their virtues, such as self-improvement. But how has this actually worked in practice? We've mainly seen this in healthcare, where various degrees of government involvement have been used with mixed results. While I don't want to digress too far into the politics around the issue, the main problem is the cost and how it gets divvied up. High taxes on everyone versus individuals buying insurance policies, often very expensive ones. There have been some other ideas floated as potential portable benefits models that include ideas like universal basic income, wage insurance, expanded and subsidized retirement savings plans, and more. Of course, ththese ideas also encounter issues with funding, administration, and eligibility requirements. Let me know if you would like for me to explore these policy ideas in more depth, and I'll try to put together a video on them. Another really important issue around the Aristotelian concepts of justice and fairness is worker classification. Basically, the whole independent contractor versus employee debate. It has become a thorny issue with huge implications for worker rights and benefits. Right now, there's a lot of confusion about how to classify gig workers, and that creates a lot of gray areas that companies can kind of exploit. For instance, a company might classify someone as an independent contractor, even though they're essentially functioning as an employee. Companies do this to avoid paying benefits and taxes, having to provide certain protections, or to dodge regulations. Aristotle's concept of justice contends that everyone should be treated fairly and receive their due. So the question is, if someone is essentially working as an employee, shouldn't they have the same rights and protections as an employee? It seems like kind of a no-brainer, but there are some complexities and challenges to getting this done in practice. One challenge is that the nature of gig work is often really different from traditional employment. For example, some gig workers often prefer to have a lot more autonomy and flexibility, such as setting their own hours, choosing which projects they want to work on, and things like that. So there's a valid argument that they're not really employees in the traditional sense. But the problem is that this classification can also leave them really vulnerable to exploitation. However, in some cases, well-meaning regulations have gone too far in the other direction, resulting in stifling the flexibility and innovation that makes the gig economy so appealing to many people in the first place. All in all, it makes the idea of worker classification a tricky balancing act, or, as Aristotle would put it, a matter of finding the golden mean. One suggestion that's been floated is to create a new category of worker that falls somewhere between independent contractor and employee. The typical classification method that most governments use, especially in the U.S., is the ABC method. Some suggest that this method could be modified, especially in the B category, to relax the definition in an industry nuanced way, recognizing that the gig economy is diverse. A one-size-fits-all approach has often encountered problems in implementation. For example, California's AB5 law initially aimed to reclassify many gig workers as employees, but faced challenges in sectors like trucking, freelance creative works, and the performing arts. This highlights the need for policies that consider the unique characteristics of different industries, creating different sets of criteria for determining dependent contractor status within specific sectors. Another issue that can raise Aristotle's justice and fairness concepts in the gig economy is the power of algorithms. Algorithms have a huge impact on how work is distributed, how gig workers are evaluated, and how much they get paid. And we know that algorithms aren't always fair and neutral. They can reflect the biases of their creators, which can lead to unfair or discriminatory outcomes. Aristotle believed that justice should be impartial and objective, not based on arbitrary factors. So the question is, how do we ensure that algorithms are used fairly in the gig economy? One solution suggestion is to increase the transparency and accountability around how algorithms are designed and used in the first place. This will be needed so that we can understand how decisions are being made and then challenge any unfairness that might be built into the system. Aristotle was a big believer in using reason and deliberation to arrive at just decisions. And it would seem that he would agree that we need to shine a light on these algorithms and make sure they're serving the common good. And it's not just about exposing bias. It's also about making sure that algorithms aren't being used to exploit workers or undermine their rights. For example, some algorithms are designed to maximize efficiency, which can lead to workers being pushed to their limits or being penalized for things they can't control. For instance, if a delivery driver gets stuck in traffic or encounters bad weather, it shouldn't count against them in the algorithm. Basically, we need to be really thoughtful about how algorithms are used and make sure they're not creating incentives for unethical or dangerous behaviors. So the overarching question is, can we take Aristotle's fundamental philosophical principles, such as justice, fairness, and virtue, and figure out how they might apply in this new gig work landscape? Where do we even start? Well, one of the most powerful things we can do as individuals is just be more conscious consumers. We should think about where we spend our money, the platforms we use, the services we rely on, all of that. Before you order that takeout meal, book that ride, or order that trinket, take a moment to consider the company you're supporting. Are they treating their workers fairly? Are they committed to ethical practices for their gig workers? Are they transparent about how they use algorithms? Because when you think about it, every dollar we spend is a vote for a particular kind of world. While we might not be able to single-handedly change the entire gig economy, or even refuse to do business with a big corporation that behaves in unethical ways, but we can, slowly but surely, make choices that help influence businesses. To put it simply, the more we talk about these things, the more likely we are to arrive at equitable compromises, actual real-world solutions. When we think about Aristotle's emphasis on virtue, it strikes me that one of the most important things we can do is to actually cultivate those virtues in our own lives. It's not just about changing the system, but also about changing ourselves. So this means practicing fairness and justice in our own interactions, being mindful of the impact our choices have on others, striving to live a life that's aligned with our values. Because the more we embody those virtues, the more likely we are to create a world that reflects them, almost like a ripple effect. It's a reminder that we're not just passive bystanders in this gig economy. We have the power to shape it for the better, both through our actions and our choices. In the pursuit of a good life, it's an ongoing journey, and it's one we take together. So, whether you're a gig worker, a consumer, a policymaker, or just a regular person trying to make sense of this rapidly changing world, remember that you have the power to make a difference. Embrace the challenges, seek out opportunities for growth, and never stop striving to create a world where everyone has the chance to flourish. And who knows? Maybe by bringing ancient wisdom into a conversation about modern work challenges, we can create a future that is both innovative and ethical, dynamic and just. It seems that's a future worth striving for. What do you think about the challenges of gig work and how Aristotle's ethical framework might fit into the picture? Can a gig economy even work in a fair and just manner? Do you believe that more government regulation is the way to go? Or do you think that letting the free market decide with minimal regulation is a better option? Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know if there are any philosophical and public policy topics you would like me to cover.